Griffin's played in just 66% of his games over the last 4 seasons, and the Pistons have not won a playoff game since '08. But gentlemen, let's go back to the Clippers. Doc Rivers with LA hasn't exactly turned out as well as Doc Rivers in Boston. Max, I'll start with you. Is this the end for him in LA?
Yes, obviously. He didn't want to be a part of a rebuild in Boston. Think of the irony of this. Doc Rivers, who's a great coach, I can't say that enough. He's a great coach, a Hall of Fame coach. He's not a good GM. So he goes, he doesn't want to be part of a rebuild in Boston. He goes to the Clippers. The Clippers window was a mirage, right? Nothing ever happened. And now look at Boston. That's not a rebuild anymore. That's pretty good. So now the claim is, I've read in reports saying, well, what they're doing in LA is they're rebuilding, but without becoming a lottery team. But that's not a good enough team to really compete in the West. So how long is Doc going to want to be there? Plus, Jerry West is there, clearly making moves that suggest maybe, what he thinks about Doc, the GM. I think Doc Rivers is probably heading back to the broadcast booth, which means that there will be an opening, for a coach. And maybe one of the guys in the broadcast booth, we have a couple, and Jeff Van Gundy and Mark Jackson, who would seem to be head coaching candidates.
Well, let me say this. Of course, there's always going to be a job in the broadcast booth for Doc Rivers. There was one for him when he left Boston, but obviously it was a trade. He was going to the Clippers, and we understand that. And even though the end had arrived in Boston, he wasn't being maligned the way that he is now. And that's what we have to pay attention to. It was the end of Doc Rivers, as far as I'm concerned, the moment Jerry West arrived. Jerry West is a consultant, but he's the one that has the air of a billionaire. And when you look at it from that perspective, clearly change was in the making. Here's my issue with Doc Rivers that I think that Doc Rivers needs to be concerned about, Jalen. Doc Rivers, in some small kind of way, is being smeared. Whether it's right or wrong, we can debate, but he's clearly being smeared. Chris Paul leaves. That's a guy that's 32 years of age as a 6-foot point guard that turned down 5 years, $200 million just so he didn't have to play for you anymore. That's a blemish. You think about other players. J.J. Redick, he departed. He said some things privately. Lord knows what Blake Griffin is going to say now that he is gone. You got Matt Barnes, a former player. Now, you could give whatever level of credence to that if you want to, even though I don't know if Matt Barnes is in a position to be saying anything. No one's ever accused him of being a liar. And he made it a point last night to tweet that that Doc Rivers, everybody knows that it's his fault in L.A. Again, that's up for debate or what have you. But if you are Steve Ballmer and Doc Rivers is your coach and all of these things are associated with him, it not only hurts you with the Clippers, it hurts you in terms of the consideration that you may or may not get elsewhere, because people are talking about you in a light that they've never talked about you before. When you couple all of that, Jalen, with the fact that he has never been able to get the Clippers to the Western Conference Finals and obviously the NBA Finals, then all of a sudden you're piggybacking off of what happened in Boston. Paul Pierce and Rondo and KG and Ray Allen and those boys may never have anything bad to say about Doc Rivers, but that clearly has not been the case with what's been emanating out of Clipperland. And that is a reality that Doc Rivers is going to have to live with, because in the end, what does it come down to? What have you done for me lately? And that is what people are going to pay attention to, which is my concern, because I think he's a damn good coach. He knows the game of basketball. But I think that there are people that are taking shots at him, and I don't know if he's going to be able to offset that.
Doc Rivers has proven himself to be a championship-level coach. The end of Doc Rivers started to happen the day that Jerry West got signed. Once you start losing jobs and you start losing power, but yet you maintain other positions, it's almost inevitable that unless your team gets off to a terrific start, you're going to be replaced. And he understands the game. Look at the returning starters. As you look at their starting team, DeAndre Jordan is the only one that's still on the roster. Blake is gone. You talked about JJ. You talked about CP3. You didn't mention Jamal Crawford. When all of those players are not on the squad anymore, that means that the organization is trying to blow it up. And I remember just recently watching the Clippers game. Jerry West, who I adore, consider him a really good friend. I was watching the game, and Jerry West was sitting right courtside right next to the bench between the scorer's table and where the players and the coaches are seated. I'm like, oh, man, it's about to be some changes. Doc may not finish this year. They're going to blow this thing up and make some moves. And the level you disrespect you talked about, Stephen A., is exactly right. Unfortunately for Doc Rivers, as players start to depart, it has started to pull at his reputation. Look no further than the altercation, allegedly, that was going to take place with the Houston Rockets after the game. If you respect your former squad, you're not trying to go in the locker room after the game after they just beat you.
If you respect the coach.
Especially to fight his son, of all people. So based on all of those scenarios, Doc Rivers had a solid run with the Clippers. They had some injuries at inopportune times. They came up short when they had an opportunity, in particular against Houston. When they were up 18, I was standing in the building, and James Harden was on the bench. I was like, the Clippers finally going to get through this. And then they even found a way to blow that. So once that happens, you understand that there's going to be roster turnover, there's going to be coaching turnover, and I understand, like,
the Clippers needed a GM, right? They needed a GM. It's almost unfortunate that Doc got too much power all at once because he was not up to the job of GM. You know, there were many examples. They needed shooting, so he took Eric Bledsoe and tried to get shooting with Eric Bledsoe, but he broke a dime into 2 nickels, which you never do in the NBA, right? He gave his son, I said the 5-star, remember that? His son was a 1-star, replacement level guy. He's turned himself with every opportunity into a 2-star at best, rotation piece. Gave him $12 million a year. Like, how does that sit in the locker room, et cetera? He wasn't a good GM. He had a running start and couldn't do much with the roster. But he's a great coach.